I'm here at the entrance to College Creek near Jamestown, Virginia, to tell you the story of how one Native American stopped the Spanish from colonizing Virginia in the year 1571. The story begins when a Spanish ship sailed up the river in 1561. The Native Americans would have gathered on this beach, and several of them rowed out to the ship on canoes to see if they could trade goods with these people. They knew that European travelers meant rare goods, such as metal tools and copper. One of the men who went out on a canoe to trade with the Spanish was Pequenquino. I hope I pronounced that right, and I apologize to any Native American who knows I pronounced it wrong. But he went out to the Spanish ship along with other men. And the Spanish either convinced him to go with them, or they just simply kidnapped him. But he ended up sailing with them back to Spain, and that's where this adventure begins for him. The leader of the Spanish expedition was Pedro Menendez, and he hoped to use Pequenquino to help him establish a colony in Virginia. On board the ship during his long journey back to Spain, Pequenquino learned to speak Spanish. He learned the basics of Christianity and much about the Spanish culture as he made his way to Spain. Once he reached Spain, he was introduced to the King of Spain, Philip II, and Philip II was impressed with Pequenquino and gave him an allowance for food and clothing. He was then sent to a Spanish monastery where he would learn more about Christianity so he could help convert the natives in America to Christianity. Then in May of 1562, Pequenquino was once again aboard a Spanish ship heading towards Mexico on his journey back to Virginia. Once in Mexico City, Pequenquino and his Native American companion became gravely ill and took a long time to recover from their illness. By the time that he'd recovered from his sickness and he was baptized as a Christian, the party did not leave Mexico City until August 1566. During his time in Mexico, Pequenquino saw how the Spanish treated the Native Americans in Mexico. He also saw that the Spanish were enslaving Africans and how they were being treated. He probably realized that this is not what he wanted for his family back in Virginia. The party of Dominican soldiers and their captain Pedro del Coronales could not find the Chesapeake Bay, and after much searching, they just determined that it was time to head back to Spain, and this colonization effort had failed. When Pequenquino returned to Spain, he took up residence in a Jesuit monastery in Seville, Spain. Here he continued his studies of Christianity and the Spanish culture. Then in early 1570, a new expedition commanded by Father Juan Baptista de Seguro left Spain with Pequenquino and headed for St. Augustine, Florida. From St. Augustine, Florida, they then sailed to Virginia and landed in Virginia in September of 1570. One of the reasons the Spanish wanted to colonize Virginia is because they did not know if the Chesapeake Bay was going to provide the water passage to the Pacific Ocean that had eluded the Spanish for years. They were also searching for gold and other precious minerals, but none would be found when they established their mission. Now, Pequenquino returned here on another Spanish ship that anchored almost in the same spot where he was picked up. And with him was a Spanish mission that he was supposed to help convert the Native Americans in this part of the country to Christianity. But Pequenquino did not want the Spanish mission to be set up at this location near College Creek. He convinced them to march across the peninsula and set up the colony near his native village, which was at the entrance of Kings Creek on the other side of the peninsula. Here, near this site, somewhere close to the mouth of Kings Creek, which you can find now on the Colonial Parkway. Well, the mission moved here and they built a cabin for the Spanish mission. The Native Americans helped them build this cabin, and they were near the Indian village where they could trade and start their mission. But just after finishing this cabin, Paquiquino left, telling the missionaries that he had to go look for some nuts and other things in the nearby village not far from here. He said he'd be back in a few days, but after 5 days he hadn't returned, and he didn't return for months. The Spanish mission was in bad shape. They did not have enough food and supplies to last. They started trading with the Indians, but unfortunately, because of the fact that there had been a drought in this area, even the Native Americans in this area did not have much food to spare. So by the time we get to the end of December in 1570, the mission is on the edge of starvation. They've traded away most of their things that they could for food, and their supplies have essentially run out. They are in desperate straits. Finally, word came that Pequenquino was staying at a village not too far from here. So the Spanish missionaries sent 3 of their party to retrieve him and bring him back to the mission. When they caught up with him, they reminded him of his duty to the mission. But that was not his intent. He agreed to come back with them, and on the way back, he attacked these 3 missionaries and killed them. Then they burnt their bodies and took their clothing. He then organized a party of Native Americans, and they returned to the Spanish mission, telling him that the others would be arriving soon. But they weren't. He then asked the missionaries for tools because he had agreed to build their chapel so that they could conduct the purpose of the mission. So after having the Spanish turn over their axes and tools so the Native Americans could build their chapel, they went home for the evening. The missionaries expected help in the morning. But what really happened was the next morning, Pequenquino and the Native Americans arrived and they killed everyone in the mission. All the missionaries were dead except for one boy who was staying with the chief or the leader of the Indian village near this spot. In the spring of 1571, Vincent Gonzalez brought down Spanish ships with supplies for the mission. But when he arrived here, he saw no signs of the missionaries. He saw some Native Americans dressed in the clothing that they had brought. And when some messengers came out to the boat, he inquired about the mission, and he could not find a satisfactory answer. But when he saw war canoes rowing towards the ship, he knew something was wrong. He fired the artillery at the canoes and captured 2 of the messengers who had come on board and sailed back to St. Augustine, where he had come from. In July of 1572, Mendez came down with a fleet of ships. He was going to search for the missing boy who had been kept captive by the Native Americans here. When he arrived in the James River again, Native Americans came out to trade. And he treated them as a friend and traded items with them until more and more came. But then a group came on board, one of them wearing a plate that they had taken from the mission. So Menendez had some of his men hide below decks. And when there was only 20 men left on board, the men attacked, seizing 13 of the Native Americans and capturing them. These men would be used as hostages so Menendez could get what he wanted from the Native Americans. The boy that was still in the captivity of the Native Americans was named Alonzo, and Menendez wanted to secure his release. So what he did is he sent word with the Native Americans that he was the boy's father, and he wanted to negotiate for his release. So he offered gifts for the return of the boy. Later, a party of about 200 Native Americans appeared here at the mouth of Kings Creek. They had the boy with them, and they traded for Alonzo, and Menendez now had the sole survivor of the massacre in his possession. Menendez was not satisfied after he'd retrieved the boy who had survived the massacre. He wanted more. He wanted Pequenquino. He wanted revenge. So he sent word with one of the warriors that was left, sent him back to the village to retrieve Pequenquino. When he did not return, he was angry. He then released 5 more of the prisoners and sent them to retrieve him. Then later, when the Native Americans returned to the beach, they rowed out to the ship in war canoes. This was more than Menendez wanted to put up with. So he hung the remaining 6 Native Americans from the yardarms and sailed out of the James River. And so ends the story, how one man stopped the Spanish from colonizing Virginia, because Menendez was never going to return to establish his colony.